Something happened last night at the gym. For some background, I made it my New Year's resolution to get back in shape, so I've been hitting the gym regularly since early December. I figured there was no harm in getting a head start. Unfortunately, I've had to work crazy hours this week, and by the time I get off work, the gym's already closed. That changed last night when I was driving home and saw the lights were on and there was a sign saying, "Now open 24/7. So spontaneously, I pulled up to the gym, grabbed my bag from the trunk, and headed inside. I almost turned around when I got there because there was no one at the front desk and no one in the gym either. But like half the fluorescents were on and there was music playing, so I figured the employee was on a break or something. So I went to the locker room to get changed. I only noticed the mess when I went to start my warm-up. The free weights were all over the place, the yoga mats were scattered on the ground, the trash bins, although empty, were on their sides. The cleaning bottles had all been knocked over, and one of them had even leaked all over a treadmill, and there were jump ropes hanging from the pull-up bars. It just looked like the gym had been open all day and the employees had just decided to go home before closing or cleaning time. Despite all of this, I put it out of my mind and jumped on the elliptical, and I put on my music knowing full well my battery was about to die any minute now. So there I was, working out like it wasn't anyone's business, letting my mind wander. I would notice the lights flicker from time to time, but I didn't really think much of it. Fluorescents flicker, and that's just what they do. I was about 15 minutes into my workout when my battery finally died, and I was fully pulled out of my headspace. At least there was some music playing, some hip-hop song I'd never heard before. After my warm-up, I moved to the weight machines, put the bolts in place, and started lifting. Suddenly, the song skipped and started right back at the beginning. A couple minutes later, at the same point in the song, it skipped again and restarted. The CD must have been scratched, I figured. When it restarted for a third time, I'd had enough. I jogged over and skipped to the next track. Could have sworn that I heard something in the silence between songs that sounded like a whimper, but I convinced myself it was just a side effect of a creepy empty gym in the early hours of the morning. That was a mistake. I went back to lifting weights and started getting really into the song before it suddenly started skipping and replaying the same line over and over again. Then, the power went out, but only for a second. To be honest, it scared me half to death. I nearly dropped the bar I was holding. The high-pitched shriek that accompanied the power outage didn't help my nerves. And no, it hadn't come from me. As soon as the lights came back on, and since the music had stopped, I was really able to hear the whimpers I thought I'd heard earlier. They drew my attention to the supply closet near the main desk. I slowly approached the door, gripped the weight, and asked loudly, "Hey, you okay in there?" The whimpering stopped immediately, like the person on the other side was trying to conceal their presence. I opened the door. She looked like a student, early 20s, maybe even a teenager. She had an employee t-shirt and was curled up in a little ball in the far corner of the room, shaking like a little leaf. She flinched when she saw me, and I quickly took a step back. I tossed the weight aside and lifted my hands to show her I meant no harm. I asked if she was okay, and she kind of just stared at me for a few seconds before she got this glint of recognition in her eyes. She quickly got up, sped past me, but grabbed my arm as she did, tugged, and said,
"We have to get out of here now."
She didn't seem all that shaken for someone who'd been crying seconds before. She had this really intense, authoritative voice to her. I couldn't help but follow her. I tried to explain that I needed to change, but she wouldn't hear it. She only stopped when I pointed out I'd left my car keys in my locker. Her confidence faltered. I heard her whisper there was no time, but she looked like she was weighing things in her mind.
"Okay,
She decided.
we'll go together, but in and out, we have to leave before it comes back."
The word "it" caught my attention. As she led me to the locker room, I pressed her on it, and her anxiety became even more apparent. Eventually, she opened up as I was trying to get my lock open. She was working the late shift, obviously, and things were going well at first. At worst, a few creeps made passes at her, but they knocked it off once she threatened to revoke their gym memberships. It was about 11 p.m., and she hadn't seen a customer in over an hour. She was bored, so she started tidying up, washing the machines, putting the weights back in place, that kind of stuff. While she was dusting the top of one of the machines, though, she heard one of the chest bars crashing to the ground. She figured the last person who used it hadn't locked it properly and put the clamps back in place. A few minutes later, the bar fell again. This time, she put it off to the side and made a mental note to tell the manager that the equipment was broken. As she was rounding up more weights, she said she felt a breath behind her neck, and thinking it was some creeper who had been hiding out in the locker room, turned on her heels and cursed at him. Except there was no one there. The weight room was empty. That's when things really started getting creepy. She was on high alert, noticing every sound and jumping at any movement. As the minutes ticked by, things started falling. She was sure someone was running around trying to make a mess and then dodging out of sight. She started looking at the mirrors to try and catch them in the act. See, the mirrors cover 3 walls, so you can see most of the room just by looking at one wall. She caught a silhouette standing on the opposite side of the gym. She described it as being dark, but without much detail to it, like a shadow, I remember her saying. Scared but convinced she'd finally caught him in the act, she turned around sharply, and as she did, she saw a weight being thrown across the floor, with nothing doing the throwing. The figure in the mirror, it was gone. Suddenly, as though all hell broke loose, all the equipment started shaking and stuff started falling all over the place. Weights flew past her, bottles of cleaner hit her in the back. She ducked into the nearby supply closet and tried to hide. She could hear objects pelting against the door, and then everything went quiet, and she heard a loud knock. She sat there in horror for a few minutes before she mustered the courage to leave, but something was blocking the door. She couldn't see very well out of the crack, but it looked like one of the weight machines had been dragged all the way to the closet and had been dropped there. So there she was in horror with the song stuck on repeat, and me around midnight entering the gym. Now, I've got to be honest, there was nothing blocking the door to the supply closet when I got there. I don't know if she imagined it or if it got moved or what. That's why I was a little skeptical, and why I was reluctant to believe her story. To me, it seemed a lot more likely that a bunch of vandals had gotten her good. I was ready to dismiss the whole thing, but as we left the locker room and headed towards the front door, I heard the CD player coming on. Radio up, radio off. And then, the deafening crash of breaking glass. I ran into the gym only to find every single floor-to-ceiling mirror shattered in pieces, with not a soul in sight who could have done it. Not even some hooligans running away like thieves in the night. The employee walked over and put a hand on my shoulder, urging me to leave. I wanted to, I really did, but I was paralyzed in horror. I swear to you on everything I hold dear, as I stood over those hundreds of broken chunks of mirror, I could see our reflections staring back at us from every angle. And in some of them, only some, I saw a dark figure standing behind us. This happened at my uncle's house back in 2001. I grew up in San Francisco, and after I graduated high school, I decided to move to a small town where my dad's family lives. The town was roughly 3 hours south of San Francisco and had a population of 70,000. It was a nice, refreshing change to the big city life I had for 14 years prior. When I finally moved, I went over to my uncle's house and asked if I could speak to him briefly. He said sure, and motioned for us to move towards a little table next to the kitchen to sit down and talk. I asked him if I could live with him and my aunt for a while as I attended community college, adding that I didn't like living alone in a new town I just moved to. He replied, "I think that will be fine." My cousin Mary was away attending her first year at university, so her room was conveniently available. I told him how thankful I was and that if he needed me to help out with anything around the house to let me know. I then left to get my things, and in a few hours I came back and only brought the essentials with me. My clothes, books, my toothbrush, and some CDs. I was really grateful that my uncle was cool about letting me live there. Almost immediately though, I felt the vibe that someone else was in the house despite knowing that it was only me and my uncle at the time. This perplexed me. One day later, I saw my uncle doing beadwork at the table, listening to a radio talk show. I asked if I could sit with him and listen. He said, "Sure, come and sit." I told him I wanted to tell him something I experienced when I moved into his house on the first day. He said, "Go ahead, tell me." So I told him my feeling of there being a vibe of other people in the house when there was only me and him in the home at the time when I moved in. My uncle responded, "You know, I'll tell you this. All the years that I've lived here, I have had some strange events that I couldn't explain, and they didn't scare me much, but one night stood out amongst the rest. One night, I was watching the History Channel and I was by myself in the house. It was close to 9 p.m. at night and your auntie wasn't home yet from her shift at the hospital. I was relaxing in my recliner when behind me in the kitchen, I began hearing the drawers and cabinets. I walked over to turn on the kitchen lights and a few of the drawers and cabinets were opened out all the way. Nothing else notable happened after that, but needless to say, I was very confused. So yes, I believe you. In a strange way, this reassured me, until a few months later, I had my own experience. When it happened, I was the only one home as my uncle and aunt were out. My uncle's house was far out in the country in the last house on the block next to a field. There were also barely any streetlights illuminating the home. That night, I was walking down the hallway leading to the room one night, and it was pitch black as it usually is. By this time, I had grown used to immediately walking into the center of the room to pull the long string tied to the ceiling fan to turn on the lights. I was feeling around in the dark for the string, and then suddenly, I saw something darker than my pitch black room move towards me. As this thing came towards me, it actually made contact with me and began pushing me out of the room. Suddenly, I wasn't able to see out of my left eye, which was even stranger. Initially, I thought it was a person, but while it was pushing me, its touch didn't feel human. This thing's would-be arms and hands felt much bigger, and where the fingers were supposed to be, there was something else. Something I would compare to an animal's paw, but without the nails and claws. Additionally, I felt this thing somehow pass through me during the time it was pushing me. After the pushing stopped, I was finally able to see out of my left eye again, and I found myself completely outside of my room in front of the bathroom door. I couldn't even begin to comprehend what had just happened. When I looked at how far I was pushed out of the room from where my ceiling fan was to where I found myself, it was a total distance of about 8 feet. Thoughts going through my head were, that's impossible, what in the world just happened? What was that? Unfortunately, I never got any more answers to those questions. Whenever I look back on this experience, it's still one of the strangest that I've had, and I thought about all the possibilities of what kind of creature or being it was. The only thing I could come up with is it was an apparition or possibly an alternate dimensional being. This thing was able to be solid, but at the same time had the ability to pass through me. If anyone out there has an idea of what kind of being I encountered, please share your thoughts. Upon doing some research on the previous families and history of the house, I actually found out that there was a woman that lived there until an unusually old age, but there wasn't anything else I was able to find out. If anything else happens or I manage to find any other relevant information, I'll let you guys know. Stay safe.